Thank you. I will now share some slides. As you can see, I slightly changed the title. And I was in the abstract, I was talking about intersectionality quite broadly, but I thought that it's better to focus because it is a short presentation anyway. And my background is in feminist science studies and queer and trans studies. And I have also now come, within the last few years, I have also come more closely to the critical feminist animal studies. And so I'm really interested in this question that at the moment, that because what I was schooled with, what I was educated with in feminist studies, that didn't include any ecofeminism whatsoever. And so there is this kind of diverging paths that ecofeminist critique has taken from mainstream feminism, and I'm kind of interested in what happened and what is going on here. And then specifically in this presentation, I'm looking at what does this question of trans-exclusivity have to do with this, and how to kind of think through trans-inclusive critical feminist animal studies. And here I'm taking Carol Adams as one example of ecofeminism, and that is because she is maybe one of the most influential and cited feminists in critical animal studies. And I specifically focus on different definitions of nature from 1990s onwards. And what about Carol Adams? We already heard some points in Laura Wright's talk. For example, the notion of absent referent, which has been important. And another thing in terms of food politics that has been important is this critique of exploitation of the reproductive abilities of chickens and cows and other animals in food production. So the production of eggs and milk, and not only the critique of killing non-human animals for food. So this project in itself is important, but then she had this concept of feminized proteins, which is a bit problematic from this trans-feminist perspective, because here Adams constructs a kind of essentialized connection between femininity, motherhood, so-called female bodies, and reproduction, calling milk and eggs feminized proteins produced by females of childbearing age who become oppressed by their femaleness and as mother animals. So here Adams' solidarity towards animals is based on a kind of naturalized connections between women, femininity, reproduction, and motherhood, which then is a kind of essentialist idea of sex, and also trans-exclusive. And then I will take one more example of this more recent trans-exclusive thinking. And this is from Adams and Gruen's edited book, Ecofeminism, Feminist Intersections with Other Animals and the Earth. And from this chapter, Groundwork, which discusses the history of the animal rights movement in relation to gender. And it is the chapter itself is a really good account, I think, except that there is this paragraph which kind of brings up this kind of trans-exclusive thinking. And they are actually justifying ecofeminism as an intersectional approach. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of pay attention to this, that if you talk about intersectional, of course, it depends how you define intersectionality, because if it's defined as a question of race critical thinking, then of course trans questions may not be included in it, but they don't define it only like that, but they talk about the different power relations. And so I think trans questions should be included in these considerations as well. And so they write about the group Feminists for Animal Rights, which contributed to the contributed this kind of trans-exclusive thinking by having a woman-born woman membership rule, which they acknowledge here. And they acknowledge that this was a source of debate, both within Feminists for Animal Rights and those who wish to start bar groups in their cities. But then they continue that the need for cis women to create safe spaces devoted to their own concerns, particularly for those who have been sexually terrorized and abused, has been seen by some to be trans-exclusive. And this is problematic because this is published in 2014. And so still Adams and Gruen make a difference here between cis and trans women. They assume that trans women are not women and that trans women would somehow cause traumas to sexually assaulted cis women. And here it's important to notice that trans women also experience violence, both because of sexism and because of the very practices of not being accepted as women. And I recommend, if somebody is interested in these topics, I recommend Talia Meyer-Becher's texts. And here, unfortunately, Adams and Gruen participate in that kind of excluding discourse. And Adams was inspired by radical feminist Mary Daly, and Daly supported actively, for example, the trans-hostile Janice Raymond's work, The Transsexual Empire, who has published this Transsexual Empire. And Daly was critiqued also by Audre Lorde, for example, for dealing with non-European women, but only as victims and preyers. And this has been analyzed by Sturgeon, for example. So in these early works, there was a kind of white feminist perspective and also this kind of essentialist understanding of women that excluded trans people. And so in these 1990s, there became kind of these diverging feminist strands on nature. So the concept of nature became interpreted in different ways. And criticizing Raymond, this trans-hostile feminist, this partly led to the emergence of trans-feminist research. And as alternatives to this radical feminism, these frameworks of, in particular, Judith Butler and Donna Haraway inspired trans-feminist theorization at the turn of the 1990s. And interestingly, of course, this is a very gross like simplification, but the mainstream of Western feminism, on the one hand, has been very much inspired by Donna Haraway's idea of nature cultures and her cyborg manifesto and everything that kind of questions the nature culture boundary. And like feminist science studies, multi-species feminisms, also parts of new materialism have been very much inspired by this Haraway's thinking. And on the other hand, the critique of essentialism led to a very critical relationship to accounts of nature. For example, critique of biological accounts of bodies, so critique of science from like outside of science, and then critique of biopolitics that affect bodies in different ways. And this shows in the present as an antagonism between, for example, between post-structuralist and new materialist feminisms. And it's important to note that at the moment that contemporarily science studies and new materialism have been also criticized for bypassing indigenous thinking. And Kim Tauber and Zoe Todd have been thinking about these issues. And then just briefly about transfeminist theorization and nature. And here are the kind of two very influential sort of classic texts in transfeminist thinking, which was Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein and Sandy Stowe's The Empire Strikes Back, which was a direct critique of this Raymond's book. And here we see this kind of influence of Butler where the critique goes that trans bodies are placed in an unassimilable, antagonistic queer relationship to a nature, where the kind of critique, in a way, is going away, away from nature and kind of criticizing binary accounts of nature. And then we have another kind of perspective here, which is because Haraway is a literary scholar and also educated in biology, and also influenced a lot influenced by biological sciences. And so here is another kind of thinking, which kind of thinks with nature, but understanding nature not as differentiated from technology, because the idea that trans women were not kind of natural women, but used technology or medicine or stuff to kind of transform their bodies. So this was in this trans hostile thinking thought as like somehow non-natural. And so the natural was defined against technology, and it was defined as kind of that only certain women, only cis women were natural. And so here is a different way of understanding nature, which is not making this this nature technology distinction. And so this kind of thinking by Donna Haraway enabled a sort of another kind of understanding of nature, a nature where physicalities were kind of constantly shifting and were not like antagonist to nature. This is maybe hard to explain in such a short time, but anyway, let's go forward. And interestingly, Haraway has inspired a lot, like the contemporary transgender studies. And interestingly, this was a bit surprising to me when I started to look at that when transgender studies is interested in nature and to think through trans with nature, there's a lot of, like Haraway seems to be the main theoretical inspiration. And here we have, for example, theorizing transgender in relation to ecology through interdependent ecological transects, and to think about trans as the with, through, of, in, and across that make life possible. Then there is the questioning of artificial binaries of gender and organic technological. So it's interesting that in contemporary transgender studies, there are scarce connections to critical animal politics or critical animal studies. And the Haraway's perspective on nature cultures, it has seemed to invite work that is focused on the interdependency and intertwining of bodies and environments. But it hasn't led so far to very much thinking about the connections of transgender studies and critical animal politics, which I think would be also an important. So it's not only that ecofeminism should kind of be trans inclusive, but also transgender studies could be thought through also with the kind of understandings of nature and animals that would be like, would show solidarity towards non-human animals as well. And then a couple of correctives to ecofeminism's gender essentialism, whiteness, and trans-exclusivity. And already in 1992, Agarwal wrote and kind of wanted to change the notion of ecofeminism to feminist environmentalism. And the point here was to understand women as active and to make contextual gender-specific analysis of environmental destruction. to acknowledge that women are not a unified category. And she argued against the idea of the connection between women and nature, but rather a focus on joint fronts between movements. So the focus here was on gender, environment, and democratic rights. And so in environmental or feminist environmentalism, the focus is a lot on environmental work and not so much on animals. So that is one trajectory where race and class, for example, are taken into account a lot, but then and the environment, but animals are not so much focused on. And then specifically a couple of examples of recent examples that try to think about trans-inclusive critical animal and food politics. And philosopher Sanna Karhu, in a forthcoming article, is arguing. Actually, they are arguing not so much against Adams, but against Greta Gard, who has a very similar perspective than Adams in this case. That critique of animal exploitation should not be based on an assumption of similarity between women, chickens, and cows. So they argue that from mammal mothers, we should move to the critique of biocapitalism. And this is interesting because this is following the Butlerian strand of thought. And so the theoretical move is kind of, to put it kind of too simply, but anyway, kind of away from nature and away from this idea of identifying as mammals, and to kind of looking at taking this kind of societal critical perspective to look at the critique of biocapitalism. And then there's another example, literature scholar Elli Lehikoinen, who has written in Finnish an article, and who has been going to like a really opposite direction in a way, because she's really looking at the potential of identification and talking about nisäkkyyteen havahtuminen, which is approximately awakening to being a mammal, especially when pregnant. And she argues that kind of awakening can enable solidarity towards the exploitation of reproductive capabilities of non-human animals. But what the difference is to some other earlier ecofeminist work is that she is making no assumptions of essential connections between womanhood, so-called female bodies, or pregnancy. And so she avoids this kind of essentialist and trans-exclusive theorization. So she is so there's interesting that one can make these theoretical moves towards trans-inclusive critical animal politics in very different ways, and kind of moving towards this identification and being a mammal, or then kind of away from this idea of being mammals and then to the critique of biocapitalism, which I think is interesting. And this is my last slide. Some further thoughts. And ecofeminism has paid, since these critiques of essentialism, ecofeminists have paid quite a lot of attention lately on gender, the connections of gender, class, race, and disability, and which is really good. And it's really, I think, intersectional perspectives in this sense are really taken up, but this trans question should still be considered, I think, a bit more. And interestingly, some of these correctives that have been made have moved towards feminist environmentalism and lack critical analysis of animal exploitation, even though race and gender are accounted for. But of course, there is now also ecofeminist work that is accounting for race, class, and gender. And interestingly, then transfeminist work that works with the notion of nature has drawn to a great extent from Haraway's thinking, and but the nature culture's perspective doesn't seem to invite so much trans-feminist solidarity towards non-human animals, but rather it theorizes the interdependency of bodies and environments. And then that these viable trans-inclusive critical animal and food political approaches, they draw from very different feminist theoretical traditions concerning nature. And it is interesting, I can't answer to this question yet, but it's interesting also because I think that both of these theoretical perspectives are very much valid. They are very different theoretically and they are a bit contradictory, but they are still very interesting. And it's, I think that multiplicity of theoretical terms is really good. But it's interesting also to think that what are the implications of these different theoretical moves related to the notion of nature for future critical feminist animal and food politics. So thank you.